The grease gun was cold enough to burn. I could feel the thermal transfer sucking the heat right out of my palm through the thick cowhide of my gloves, a dull, aching reminder that Lake Erie did not care about thermodynamics or OSHA regulations. It just wanted to equalize everything to zero. I adjusted my grip, wiping a smear of lithium complex grease from the nozzle, and located the Zerk fitting on the bearing housing of pump number 3. It was a massive centrifugal unit, a vertical turbine pump capable of moving 20 million gallons a day. But right now it was just a vibrating collection of cold cast iron and stainless steel that needed lubrication. The vibration was the heartbeat of the crib. It came up through the soles of my Red Wing boots, a low-frequency thrum that rattled your teeth if you clamped your jaw too tight. Click. Hiss. Pump. I counted the strokes. 1, 2, 3. You did not overgrease a bearing like this. Too much pressure and you'd blow the seals, letting in the lake water. And then you'd have a catastrophic seizure on the main shaft. I was a technician, not a gambler. Precision was the only religion that paid dividends out here. I wiped the fitting clean with a blue shop rag, checking the visual indicator. Good. I stood up, my knees popping loud enough to be heard over the drone of the intake fans. The crib, formerly the Cleveland Water Intake Crib, was essentially a concrete fortress sitting 3 miles offshore. It was a relic of late 19th century engineering. A hollow artificial island designed to suck relatively clean water from the bottom of the lake and send it down a massive tunnel, 3 miles long and 50 feet below the lakebed, to the treatment plant on the shore. It was a tomb for the living. Round, brick-lined, capped with a steel roof that screamed under the abuse of the winter gales. Inside, it was a hollow cylinder, a grand atrium of industrial functionalism. I was the caretaker of the gears, the guardian of the flow. I checked my watch. 16:45. Shift change was not for another 12 hours. I was on the week-on rotation, living in the cramped quarters suspended above the pump floor. My partner, Miller, had called in sick yesterday with a flu that sounded wet and rattling over the radio. So I was solo. Just me, the pumps, and the ghost of the lake. I walked the catwalk, the steel grating clanging under my weight. I needed to check the bar screens. The intake ports, located way down in the submerged belly of the structure, were protected by massive steel grates to stop fish, logs, and debris from being sucked into the drinking supply. But in January, the enemy was frazzle ice, sticky, slushy ice crystals that formed in supercooled, turbulent water. If the frazzle built up on the screens, it would choke the intake. The head pressure would drop, the pumps would cavitate, and the city of Cleveland would go dry. I reached the monitoring station on the west wall. The analog gauges were twitching slightly. Delta P, differential pressure, across the screens was 2.5 psi. Acceptable. Anything over 5, and I'd have to run the backwash system. I poured a cup of coffee from the thermos I'd left on the control desk. It was lukewarm and tasted like scorched metal. I took a sip and looked out the reinforced porthole facing south, toward the city. That was when I saw the lights go out. It was not a flicker. It was not the rolling brownout you see during a summer heat wave when everyone cranks their AC. This was a cascade. I watched the glittering skyline of Cleveland, the terminal tower, the glowing grid of the streets, the industrial sprawl of the flats simply vanish. It happened in sections, like a circuit board being submerged in ink. West to east. The darkness swept across the horizon, swallowing the twinkling artificial constellations of civilization. For a moment, I just stared, the rim of the thermos touching my lip. Grid failure, I muttered. My voice sounded flat in the acoustic echo chamber of the crib. I waited for the emergency lights on the shore to kick in. Hospitals, police stations, the rich condos with backup systems. Usually, after a blackout, you'd see the scattered pinpricks of generator power blinking back into existence within 30 seconds. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. The horizon remained a black void, indistinguishable from the black water of the lake and the black sky above. The only light came from the stars, cold and indifferent, and the sodium vapor glow of my own station, powered by the crib's massive diesel generators which were currently chugging away in the basement. I set the coffee down. A specific kind of knot tightened in my stomach. It was not fear, exactly. It was the feeling you get when you drop a nut into a running engine block. The realization of an irreversible mechanical error. I picked up the radio handset. Channel 16, Marine Emergency. Coast Guard Sector Buffalo, this is Intake Crib 5. Radio check. Over. Static. Not the clean, white noise of an open channel. This was a jagged, tearing sound, layered with unintelligible spikes of interference. I switched to the company frequency. Dispatch, this is Crib 5. I have visual on a total blackout on shore. Verify status. Over. Silence. Then a burst of sound that made me wince. It was not words. It was an open mic broadcasting a continuous, high-pitched scream that distorted into digital garbage, followed by a wet, percussive thud. Then the carrier wave cut out. I stared at the handset. The plastic was greasy in my hand. I did not panic. Panic burns calories and clouds judgment. I was an engineer. I broke problems down. Variable 1. The power is out on shore. Variable 2. Communications are compromised. Variable 3. I am 3 miles offshore in a concrete tower surrounded by near-freezing water. I walked over to the main breaker panel. The crib was currently running on island mode. We had 2 massive Caterpillar diesel generators in the sublevel. They were fed by a 5,000-gallon belly tank. At current load, I had power for 3 months if I managed it. If I shut down the main pumps, which, if the shore was dead, were pumping water to nowhere, I could stretch that to a year. But first, I needed to see. I grabbed the heavy-duty binoculars from the hook by the window. I braced my elbows against the cold concrete sill to stabilize the image and focused on the shoreline, 3 miles away. The optics were German, crisp and expensive. The city was dark, but it was not dead. Fires were starting. Small ones at first, uncontrolled blazes in the residential zones, probably from candles or overturned heaters. But then I saw the highway. The shoreway was a ribbon of snarled chaos. Headlights were pointed in every direction, a tangled mess of steel. And there was movement. At this distance, people were just specks, but the flow of the crowd was unmistakable. It was not the orderly evacuation of a fire drill. It was fluid dynamics applied to biology. A turbulent flow. A stampede. They were pouring toward the water. I adjusted the focus knob. The frantic motion on the docks. I saw a boat, a small pleasure craft, pull away from the pier. It did not get far. Another boat slammed into its side, T-boning it. I saw figures jumping between the hulls, fighting. Civil unrest, I diagnosed aloud. Total structural collapse of social order. I lowered the binoculars. The silence of the crib was suddenly oppressive. The hum of the pumps felt like a countdown. I had a choice. Option A. Take the service tunnel back to shore. The tunnel was a marvel of engineering, a 10-foot diameter brick-lined tube buried under the clay of the lake bed. It housed the raw water pipe and a narrow electric railway for the maintenance cart. It was the umbilical cord connecting me to the mainland. If I took the cart, I'd be on shore in 15 minutes. I could be home in 40. I could check on... who? My parents were dead. My ex-wife lived in Cincinnati. I had a cat. Option B. Stay. I looked back at the binoculars. The fires were growing. The orange glow was reflecting off the low cloud deck, painting the lake in a bruised purple light. I saw the muzzle flashes now, tiny rhythmic sparks popping in the darkness of the chaotic streets. If I went down that tunnel, I would emerge into a kill zone. The treatment plant at the other end was a secure facility, but if the city was burning, the plant would be the first place people went for water. It would be a siege. And the tunnel itself? If the power failed at the plant end, the elevators would not work. I'd be trapped in a 3-mile-long tube, 50 feet underground, walking in the dark. And if the ventilation fans in the tunnel stopped, methane pockets from the lake bed. Suffocation. No, I said. The tunnel is a fatal funnel. I turned away from the window. The decision was made. The logic was cold and hard, like the steel floor plates. I was safe here. I had heat. I had water. I had height. But I was not secure. I moved immediately. The lethargy of the routine vanished, replaced by the sharp, adrenaline-fueled focus of emergency mitigation. First, the tunnel. I grabbed my tool bag, a heavy canvas bucket filled with the essentials. A set of Klein lineman's pliers, a Milwaukee impact driver, a set of deep well sockets, and a pry bar. I descended the spiral staircase, my hand sliding down the cold railing, down past the pump floor, down past the generator room, down into the wet, echoing throat of the crib. The air grew damper as I descended. The smell changed from diesel and grease to the mineral, fishy scent of raw lake water and wet limestone. I reached the tunnel head. The entrance to the tunnel was a heavy freight elevator and a set of stairs spiraling down a vertical shaft. Beside it was the airlock door, a heavy steel bulkhead designed to withstand the pressure of the lake if the shaft flooded. Currently, the door was open. The electric cart sat on its rails, plugged into the charger. I could not just close the door. If someone on the other end had power, or if they figured out the manual override, they could send the cart back. Or they could walk. 3 miles is a long walk, but desperation is a powerful fuel. I looked at the elevator controls. I opened the panel using a flathead screwdriver. Inside was a nest of wiring, labeled with faded, mesmerizing strips. I found the main control relay. Using my side cutters, I did not just cut the wire. I stripped a section of the control loop and twisted it together with the ground, creating a hard short. Then I pulled the 480-volt fuses from the disconnect box. I pocketed the fuses. The elevator was dead. Next, the stairs. A spiral metal staircase wound around the elevator shaft, descending 200 feet to the tunnel level. I could not destroy the stairs, I might need them, but I could deny access. I looked around the staging area. There were pallets of sodium hypochlorite, bleach, stacked for water treatment. Heavy plastic drums, 55 gallons each, weighing roughly 500 pounds apiece. I wheeled a drum over to the head of the stairs using a hand truck. I tipped it. It crashed onto its side with a deafening boom that echoed up the shaft. I shoved it until it wedged against the railing and the center pillar. It was not enough. I went back for another. And another. 20 minutes of sweating, grunting labor. My breath steamed in the cold air. I built a barricade of chemical drums, 3 high, jamming them tightly into the spiral of the staircase. To move them from the bottom, you'd have to push 1,500 pounds uphill against gravity on a slick metal surface. Without a winch, it was physics prohibitive. Finally, the bulkhead door. It was a marine-grade watertight door, heavy steel with a wheel-actuated locking mechanism. I swung it shut. The hinges groaned, a sound of rust and neglected grease. I spun the wheel, watching the locking dogs extend and bite into the frame. Clunk, 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 clunk. Sealed. But a wheel can be turned from the outside. I took my impact driver and a 3/4-inch drill bit. I drilled a hole through the steel of the wheel's rim and into the door frame behind it. The sound was a shriek of tortured metal that left my ears ringing. Metal shavings, hot and sharp, curled onto the floor. I ran a high-tensile steel bolt through the hole and tightened a nut on the inside until it screamed. Then I took a ball-peen hammer and smashed the threads of the bolt, mushrooming the metal so the nut could not be backed off. The door was now mechanically fused. To open it, you would need an oxyacetylene torch or an angle grinder and a lot of time. I stood back, breathing heavy. The tunnel was secured. The umbilical cord was cut. I was an island now, in every sense of the word. I climbed back up to the main level, my legs burning from the stairs. The physical exertion had kept the cold at bay, but as I stopped, the chill of the lake began to seep back in. The crib was uninsulated concrete. It was essentially a chimney standing in a freezer. I needed to secure the upper perimeter. The crib had a boat landing on the exterior, a concrete pier about 10 feet above the waterline, accessible by a steel ladder bolted to the side of the crib. I went to the tool room and grabbed the bolt cutters. I stepped out onto the exterior gantry. The wind hit me like a physical blow. A northeasterly gale was picking up, screaming across the fetch of Lake Erie. The temperature was dropping. The spray from the waves crashing against the base of the crib, 50 feet below, was freezing instantly upon contact with the concrete, creating a glaze of verglas ice. I shuffled along the grating, clipping my safety harness to the railing. I made my way to the access ladder that led down to the boat landing. It was a cage ladder. If someone came by boat, this was their entry point. I leaned over the railing. The dark water churned below, whitecaps glowing in the starlight. The ladder was already caked in ice. I positioned the jaws of the bolt cutters on the top rung. I bore down. The steel was cold and brittle. With a sharp snap, the rung gave way. I worked my way down, cutting every second rung for the top 10 feet. Then, realizing that a determined climber could still shimmy up the rails, I unbolted the entire top section of the ladder cage. It swung loose, held only by a rusted safety chain. I kicked it. The heavy steel assembly fell, crashing into the icy water below and sinking instantly. Now, there was a 20-foot gap between the boat landing and the lowest accessible point of the structure. Smooth, ice-covered concrete. Unclimbable without specialized mountaineering gear. I retreated inside, locking and deadbolting the heavy steel storm door behind me. I was alone. I walked back to the control desk. The coffee was ice cold now. I picked it up and drank it anyway. The caffeine was necessary. I sat in the command chair, a torn ergonomic office chair that had seen better decades, and looked at the system status board. Fuel level, 82%. Outdoor temp, minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 27 degrees with wind chill. Intake flow, 0 GPM. Pumps tripped on interlock when shore pressure failed. The silence was total now. Since the main pumps had tripped off, the only sound was the low rumble of the diesel generator in the basement and the howling of the wind outside. The building felt different without the vibration of the water moving. It felt dead. I looked at the radio. Still static. I looked at the shore. The fires had merged into larger conflagrations. The smoke was drifting out over the lake, blotting out the stars. It looked like the mouth of hell opening up in Ohio. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering not from the cold, but from the adrenaline crash. I was a technician. I had secured the facility. I had followed protocol, adapted for extreme circumstances. But as I watched my city burn, I realized the one variable I could not engineer away. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a protein bar, a stale granola block wrapped in foil. I tore it open with my teeth. Inventory, I whispered to the empty room. Tomorrow, I need to do a full inventory. I took a bite. It tasted like sawdust and artificial chocolate. The water in the intake shaft below me was dark, deep, and silent. I was sitting on top of millions of gallons of water, but I did not know how much of it I could actually drink. I had no filtration system for personal use. The crib was just a straw. The filter was on the shore, where the fires were. I looked at the radiator in the corner. It was electric, powered by the generator. It ticked as it warmed up. I pulled the logbook toward me. I uncapped a pen. Date, January 14th. Time, 21:00. Status, grid failure. Civil collapse observed onshore. Facility secured. Tunnel locked down. Exterior access severed. Notes. Generator fuel is finite. Food stores are unknown. Ambient temperature dropping. I closed the book. The leather cover felt cold. I was not a soldier. I was not a survivalist with a bunker full of MREs. I was a guy who knew how to fix pumps and read wiring diagrams. I looked at my hands. They were stained with grease and nicked from the drill. Work the problem, I said. It was the mantra of the trade. If you panic, you die. If you freeze, you die. You look at the broken machine, you find the fault, and you apply leverage. I laid my head on the desk, listening to the wind trying to peel the steel roof off my sanctuary. The first night had begun. I woke up to the sound of thermal contraction. The steel roof of the crib, cooling rapidly in the pre-dawn temperature drop, let out a series of sharp, resonant bangs that sounded like gunfire. I sat up in the ergonomic chair, my neck stiff, a layer of condensation dampening the collar of my coveralls. My breath plumed in front of me, thick and white. The electric radiator in the corner was humming, fighting a losing battle against the cubic footage of the room. The control room was roughly 20 by 30 feet with 12-foot ceilings, too much volume to heat with a single 1,500-watt resistive element. The thermal bridge of the uninsulated concrete walls was sucking the energy out as fast as the coil could generate it. I checked the thermometer. 42 degrees Fahrenheit inside. Outside, the wind chill was driving the mercury down to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. My mouth felt like it was packed with cotton. Thirst. It was a dull, persistent ache in the back of the throat, the body's warning light blinking red. I walked to the break room kitchenette. I shook the 5-gallon jug on the water cooler. Empty. Just a hollow glug of plastic. I checked the tap. Nothing. The domestic water system relied on a small pressure tank and a pump in the basement, which drew from a treated cistern. The cistern was likely dry, or the pump had lost its prime when the power flickered. I looked at the sink. I turned the handle. A gasp of air, then a brown dribble of rust water. Then silence. I was surrounded by 6 quadrillion gallons of water, Lake Erie, and I was about to die of dehydration. The lake water was death. Even in winter, it was a biological soup of agricultural runoff, giardia, cryptosporidium, and whatever toxic sludge was currently leaking from the burning city. Drinking it raw would induce severe dysentery within 24 hours. Diarrhea leads to rapid dehydration. In these temperatures, that metabolic crash would kill me before the bacteria did. I needed a refinery. I spent the next hour doing a calm, methodical inventory of the facility's digestive system. I needed to build a distillation unit. Filtration was not enough. I did not have submicron filters to catch viruses, and boiling only killed the bugs. It did not remove the chemical contaminants or the suspended solids. Distillation, turning water to steam and condensing it back to liquid, was the gold standard. I grabbed my tool bag and headed for the HVAC mechanical room on the second level. The room was dark, illuminated only by the beam of my headlamp. It smelled of ozone and dust. I located the target, an old decommissioned window air conditioning unit sitting in the boneyard pile of scrap parts. I needed the condenser coil. I knelt on the concrete floor, the cold seeping through the knees of my Carhartts. I pulled out my side cutters and a 1/4-inch nut driver. I began stripping the chassis. The sheet metal screws were rusted, fused to the frame by years of damp lake air. I had to lean my entire body weight into the driver to break the torque, feeling the rusty grit grind in the threads. Pop, pop, pop. I peeled back the casing. Inside was the treasure, a continuous loop of 3/8-inch copper tubing, finned with aluminum for heat dissipation. I did not want the aluminum fins. They would trap dirt and bacteria. I needed bare copper. I took a pair of tin snips and cut the U-bends off one side of the radiator to free the straight lengths of pipe, but that would leave me with short segments. I needed a coil. I looked at the evaporator side. It was a continuous serpentine run. Perfect. Using a tubing cutter, a small C-shaped tool with a hardened steel wheel, I clamped onto the inlet line. I tightened the knob, rotated the tool, tightened again. Spin, tighten, spin. The steel wheel bit into the soft copper. With a final twist, the pipe parted cleanly, leaving a bright, shiny rim of exposed metal. I extracted the coil. Now came the tedious part, removing the aluminum fins. I took the coil back to the workshop. I clamped one end in the bench vise. Using a pair of needle-nose pliers, I began peeling the aluminum sheets off the copper tube. It was slow, repetitive work. The aluminum was sharp. It sliced into my gloves, fraying the leather. Rip, twist, discard. I worked for 2 hours. My forearms burned with the lactic acid buildup of repetitive motion. The pile of crinkled aluminum grew on the floor, glittering in the work light. When I was done, I had roughly 20 feet of bare, 3/8-inch copper tubing. It was ugly, scarred from the pliers, but structurally sound. Next, the boiler. I went to the break room and found the largest vessel available, a stainless steel stockpot, maybe 3 gallons, used for the crew's chilly nights. It had a heavy lid. I placed the lid on the drill press table. I marked a center point with a punch. I selected a step drill bit, a conical bit that drills progressively larger holes. I oiled the bit with a drop of cutting fluid. Whirr! The drill bit bit into the stainless steel. Stainless is hard. It work hardens if you drill too slow or let the bit rub. I applied steady, heavy pressure, watching the spiral shavings of steel curl up the flutes of the bit. Smoke rose from the cut, smelling of sulfurized oil. I drilled until I had a 1/2-inch hole. Now for the union. I found a brass compression fitting in the plumbing parts bin. 1/2-inch NPT male thread to 3/8-inch compression. I threaded the fitting into the hole in the lid. It was a loose fit. Steam would escape. I needed a gasket. Rubber would melt or impart a taste. I dug through the hazardous materials cabinet and found a tube of RTV Red, high-temperature silicone gasket maker, rated for 650 degrees Fahrenheit. I applied a thick bead of the red paste around the fitting and tightened a retaining nut on the underside. I smeared more silicone over the junction. It looked like a bloody wound, but it would seal. While the silicone cured, I built the condenser jacket. Distillation requires a temperature differential. The steam needs to hit a cold surface to condense back into water. I could just run the copper tube through the air, but air is a poor conductor. Water is better. I found a length of 4-inch PVC pipe, a remnant from a drain repair. I cut a 2-foot section using a hacksaw. The PVC dust coated my arms in white powder. I drilled 2 holes in the side of the PVC pipe, one near the bottom, one near the top, and threaded in hose barbs. This would be my cooling jacket. I carefully straightened the copper coil I had salvaged, then rewound it around a piece of 2-inch steel pipe to form a tight, uniform spiral that would fit inside the PVC. This was the most delicate part. If I kinked the copper, the flow would be restricted. The pressure would build in the boiler, and the whole thing could explode. I worked slowly, using my thumbs to massage the copper into the curve. The metal was cold and stiff. I could feel the material resistance, the point where it wanted to buckle. I eased it past the yield point, millimeter by millimeter. Once the coil was formed, I slid it inside the 4-inch PVC pipe. I used 2 PVC end caps, drilled through the centers to allow the copper tube to protrude. I sealed the caps with PVC cement, the purple primer smelling sharp and chemical, followed by the clear solvent weld. The result was a Liebig condenser on steroids. Steam would enter the top of the copper coil. Cold lake water would be pumped into the bottom of the PVC jacket and exit the top, sucking the heat out of the copper. The steam would condense and drip out the bottom as pure, distilled water. But how to pump the cooling water? I did not have running water. I had to use gravity. I rigged a siphon system. I took a 5-gallon bucket and placed it on top of a storage locker, 6 feet in the air. I ran a rubber hose from the bucket to the bottom inlet of my PVC condenser. From the top outlet, I ran another hose down to a waste bucket on the floor. As long as I kept the top bucket filled with ice-cold slush from the balcony, gravity would pull the cold water through the jacket. Finally, the heat source. I could not use the electric stove in the break room. It was too far from my water source, and I needed to conserve heat in the control room. I cannibalized a hot plate, a single-burner 1,000-watt coil unit. I set the hot plate on the concrete floor of the control room. I placed the stainless steel stock pot on the coil. I connected the copper tube from the pot's lid to the inlet of my condenser using a flare nut. I needed raw water. I grabbed a plastic bucket and a coil of rope. I unlocked the heavy storm door to the gantry. The wind hit me again, a physical assault. The sky was gray iron. The lake was churning, waves smashing against the crib's legs 50 feet below. I tied the rope to the bucket handle and lowered it. I watched it swing in the gale, banging against the concrete side. Clang, clang. It hit the water. I let it sink, then hauled it up. 50 feet of wet rope. My gloves were soaked instantly. The water froze in the fibers, turning the rope into a stiff, icy rod. My shoulders burned. I hauled the bucket over the rail, sloshing gray, freezing water onto my boots. I retreated inside, locking the storm door. My hands were numb claws. I had to beat them against my thighs to restore circulation before I could pick up the pitcher. I filled the stock pot. I clamped the lid down using C-clamps from the tool room, compressing the rim against the pot to create a seal. I plugged in the hot plate. Now, the wait. I sat on the floor, watching the rig. The physics were simple, but the execution was life or death. The coil glowed a dull orange. The pot began to make noise, a low rumble as the water near the element boiled. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. The copper tube coming out of the lid grew hot to the touch. Steam was rising. It entered the condenser. I watched the clear vinyl hose of the cooling jacket. I opened the valve on my gravity feed. Cold water rushed into the PVC pipe, surrounding the hot copper coil. I heard a hiss, then a gurgle. And then, from the bottom of the copper coil, a single drop of water fell. It landed in the glass mason jar I had positioned underneath. It was crystal clear. Drip, 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 drip. The rate increased to a steady trickle. I watched it with the intensity of a diamond cutter. That was not just water. It was time. It was life. I let the first few ounces run into the waste bucket, just to flush out any manufacturing oils or flux residue from the copper. Then I slid the clean jar under the stream. When the jar was half full, I picked it up. The glass was warm. I took a sip. It tasted flat. Distilled water has no minerals, no flavor profile. It tastes like nothing. But it was smooth. It did not taste like fish or algae or rust. It tasted like engineering. I drank the whole jar. I could feel it hitting my stomach, absorbing instantly. Constraint 1. Solved. But the cold was still gnawing at me. The electric radiator was useless against the thermal mass of the crib. I was burning kilowatts to heat concrete that was in direct contact with freezing lake water. It was a thermal short circuit. I needed to reduce the volume. I looked at the corner of the control room, behind the main desk. A nook formed by the server racks and the wall, roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. I went to the storage room again. I found a roll of heavy-duty 6mm polyethylene sheeting, visqueen, used for asbestos abatement or dust containment. I dragged the roll back to the control room. I also grabbed a handful of spring clamps and a roll of duct tape. I began to construct a micro-habitat. I clamped the plastic sheeting to the top of the server racks, draping it down to the floor to create a wall. I ran another sheet from the top of the racks to the window frame, creating a ceiling. I taped the seams with obsessive care. Every gap was a heat leak. Rip, stick, smooth. I doubled the layers. Air is the insulator. The plastic just traps it. By creating a 1-inch gap between 2 layers of plastic, I was creating a crude, double-paned thermal barrier. I moved the mattress from the bunk room, which was freezing, into my new plastic tent. I dragged the electric radiator inside. I moved my distillation rig to the entrance of the tent so the waste heat from the hot plate would flow into my living space. I crawled inside and sealed the flap with a magnetic strip I'd peeled off a refrigerator door gasket. The difference was noticeable within minutes. The volume of air inside the tent was only about 300 cubic feet. The 1,500-watt heater, plus the 1,000-watt hot plate, plus my own 100-watt body heat, began to load the space. The temperature on my portable sensor climbed. 45 degrees C's, 50 degrees C's, 55 degrees C's. I took off my heavy parka. I could move my fingers without pain. I lay back on the mattress. The walls of my tent were translucent, glowing softly from the light of the hot plate coil outside. The hum of the generator downstairs was a distant vibration, dampened by the floor. I had water. I had heat. I had a perimeter. I closed my eyes, listening to the rhythmic drip-drip of the still. It was a metronome. But then, a new sound cut through the drone. It came from the ventilation duct overhead, the large galvanized intake that brought fresh air into the control room from the roof vents. Thump. It was a soft, heavy sound, like a wet sandbag hitting metal. I froze. My eyes snapped open, staring at the plastic ceiling of my tent. Scrape. Screech. Metal on metal. Something was moving inside the ventilation shaft. The ducts were 24-inch square, large enough for a man. Or something else. I sat up, grabbing the pry bar I had left next to the mattress. I turned off the hot plate to kill the light, plunging the tent into darkness. I held my breath, straining my ears against the silence. The scraping stopped. Then, a low, guttural sound echoed down the tin tunnel. It was not a voice. It sounded like a dog trying to clear its throat, but wetter, deeper. It was directly above the register grill in the center of the control room ceiling. I realized my mistake instantly. I had secured the doors. I had secured the tunnel. I had cut the ladder. But I had forgotten the HVAC intakes on the roof. They were just hooded vents. If the snow piled high enough, or if something could climb the sheer concrete walls. I gripped the pry bar until my knuckles turned white. The engineering phase was over. The test had begun. The sound was wet and heavy, like a side of beef being dragged over a gravel road. It echoed inside the 24-inch galvanized steel ductwork, amplified by the tin can acoustics of the ventilation shaft. Scrape. Thud. Hiss. I lay frozen in my polyethylene tent, the hair on my arms standing up in the static charged air. The noise was not coming from the roof anymore. It was directly above the drop ceiling register in the center of the control room. I watched the rectangular aluminum grill. It was a standard 24 by 24-inch diffuser held in place by 4 sheet metal screws screwed into the drywall of the ceiling soffit. It was not designed to hold weight. It was designed to direct airflow. As I watched, the center of the grill bowed downward. Creak. A white screw head popped from the corner, pinging off the metal louvers and falling to the floor. The grill sagged 3 inches. Through the gap I saw movement. Not the mechanical rotation of a damper, but the organic, chaotic shifting of flesh. Something dark. Something leaking. A thick, viscous fluid dripped from the gap, splattering onto the linoleum floor. It was not panic that hit me. It was a cold calculation of structural load limits. The creature, whatever it was, weighed at least 200 pounds. The remaining 3 screws were biting into maybe 1/8 of an inch of light-gauge steel stud. Sheer strength was failing. I rolled out of the tent, grabbing the pry bar and my headlamp. I could not fight this thing, not in a wrestling match. Biology is messy. Engineering is clean. I needed to turn this encounter into a physics problem. I sprinted to the corner where I kept the facility's maintenance ladder, a 10-foot fiberglass Werner stepladder. I dragged it to the center of the room, positioning it directly under the sagging vent. The creature hissed, a sound like high-pressure air escaping a punctured tire. It sensed me. The banging increased. The second screw sheared off. The grill swung down, hanging by 2 corners. I did not climb the ladder. I did not try to push it back. I ran to the wall where the electrical conduit was mounted. I grabbed a 10-foot length of 1 5/8 unistrut, heavy-duty slotted steel channel used for mounting pipes. It was solid steel, U-shaped, rigid. I jammed one end of the unistrut against the floor, angling it upward. I lined up the top end with the center of the bowing grill. I kicked the base of the strut, driving it vertical. Wham! The steel channel slammed into the grill, pinning it back against the ceiling. It acted as a deadman brace. The creature let out a shriek that vibrated in my molars, slamming its weight against the metal. The unistrut bowed slightly under the impact, but the compressive strength of the steel held. I kicked the base again, wedging it tighter. I grabbed a roll of duct tape from my belt and taped the strut to the ladder to prevent it from slipping sideways. It was a temporary patch, a band-aid on a bullet wound. The creature was trapped in the horizontal run of the duct, right above my head. But ductwork is a network. If it could not get out here, it would crawl back to the trunk line, and the trunk line led to the mechanical room on the lower level. The mechanical room. My stomach dropped. The mechanical room housed the diesel day tank, the backup batteries, and the main switchgear. It was the heart of the crib. If that thing got in there and started thrashing around, it could short a bus bar or rupture a fuel line. If I lost the generator, I froze. I had to intercept it. I grabbed my tool bag. I needed a weapon, not a hammer. A hammer requires proximity. I needed a force multiplier. I remembered the steam Jenny. In the storage bay, we had a Hotzi industrial steam pressure washer, diesel-fired, capable of generating 3,000 psi at 250 degrees Fahrenheit. We used it for de-icing the exterior walkways and degreasing engine parts. It was my flamethrower. I bolted out of the control room, locking the heavy steel door behind me. I slid down the handrails of the spiral staircase, my boots ringing on the metal steps. I hit the landing of the mechanical room level and paused. The room was vast and shadowed, lit only by the emergency LEDs on the generator enclosure. The massive Caterpillar V12 diesel engine was chugging away in its sound-attenuated housing, a steady rhythm that masked smaller noises. The overhead ductwork here was massive, rectangular trunks 3 feet wide, wrapped in foil-backed insulation. I scanned the layout. The duct from the control room fed into the main air handling unit, AHU, a box the size of a minivan where the heating coils and filters lived. To get out, the creature would have to pass through the AHU plenum. I ran to the utility sink. I hooked up the Hotzi's water supply hose. I checked the fuel tank on the washer, half full of red-dye diesel. Enough. I unspooled the high-pressure hose, 50 feet of steel braided rubber. I attached the wand, selecting the 0-degree red nozzle, a pinpoint jet that cut like a laser. I dragged the machine toward the AHU. I plugged it into a 240-volt welding outlet. Click. The pump primed. I squeezed the trigger to purge the air. A cold jet of water shot across the room. I flipped the burner switch. The diesel burner ignited with a whoosh, sounding like a jet engine starting up. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust port before clearing to a heat shimmer. The water coming out of the wand turned to steam. White, opaque, violent steam. Now, the trap. The AHU had an access door, a small panel held on by cam latches. I could not open it. The thing would jump me. I needed a port. I grabbed my cordless drill and a 1-inch hole saw. I listened to the ductwork. Thump, scratch. Thump. It was coming. It was navigating the 90-degree drop from the upper level. It was moving fast, driven by frustration and the smell of the diesel exhaust. I climbed on top of the AHU box. The metal skin was cold and slick. I positioned the drill over the mixing plenum, the chamber where the return air mixes with fresh air. This was the choke point. I waited. The sound grew louder. I could hear the tin flexing. It sounded like a dog digging under a fence, frantic and sharp. Scritch, scratch. It was in the box. I pulled the trigger on the drill. The hole saw shrieked as it bit into the galvanized sheet metal. Zzz! Clunk. The pilot bit punched through. The saw cut a clean 1-inch disc. I pulled the drill back. A smell hit me instantly. Not the rot I expected, but something copper and musky. Ancient. A gray, withered finger, too long, too many joints, poked through the hole I had just made, feeling the air. I did not hesitate. I jammed the tip of the pressure washer wand into the hole. I squeezed the trigger. The physics of the situation were horrific. I was injecting 3.5 gallons per minute of superheated water and steam into a confined space of roughly 60 cubic feet. The expansion ratio of water to steam is 1 into 1600. I was essentially turning the AHU into a pressure cooker. The sound inside the box changed instantly. The scratching stopped, replaced by a wet, frenzied thrashing. The metal walls of the AHU bulged and boomed as the creature slammed against them, trying to escape the thermal assault. Thud, thud, thud. I held the wand steady, bracing my shoulder against the recoil. The steam backwashed around the nozzle, scalding my gloved hands, but I did not let go. The shrieking started. It was not human. It was the sound of a tea kettle screaming through a throat filled with fluid. It rose in pitch, vibrating the sheet metal under my knees. I kept the trigger down. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. The temperature inside that box would be climbing past 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Proteins denature at 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Skin scalds instantly at 150 degrees Fahrenheit. The thrashing became rhythmic, desperate convulsions. The heavy steel latches on the access door groaned. If that door popped, I was dead. The steam cloud would blind me, and the thing would be on me. I leaned my weight on the door, praying the cam locks held. Suddenly, the generator faltered. The hot sea was drawing massive amperage for the heating coil and the motor simultaneously. The Caterpillar engine bogged down, the frequency dropping. The lights dimmed. "Do not you die on me!" I yelled, my voice lost in the roar of the steam. I watched the fuel gauge on the pressure washer. It was drinking diesel. Inside the box, the screaming stopped. The thuds turned into soft, wet slaps. Then nothing. I kept spraying for another full minute. I wanted it boiled. I wanted it sterilized. I released the trigger. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water inside the plenum and the idle of the generator returning to a smooth hum. I stepped back, my legs trembling. Steam curled lazily from the hole I had drilled. I was not done. Confirmation is a survival imperative. I grabbed the thermal imaging camera from the electrical test bench. I pointed it at the AHU. The metal box was glowing white-hot on the screen. The insulation was holding the heat, but in the center, there was a dense, red mass on the floor of the unit. Motionless. I waited for an hour. I sat on a bucket, the pry bar across my lap, watching the temperature drop. When the metal was cool enough to touch, I prepared for the extraction. I could not leave it in there. It would rot. The spores or bacteria would be blown through the entire ventilation system, turning my air supply into a biological weapon. I put on a P100 respirator mask. I pulled on chemical-resistant nitrile gloves over my leather ones. I unlocked the cam latches of the access door. 1, 2, 3. I kicked the door open and stepped back, pry bar raised. A cloud of warm, wet vapor rolled out. It smelled like boiled cabbage and copper. I shined my flashlight into the plenum. The thing was huddled in the corner, tangled in the heating coils. It was compacted. The steam had cooked the flesh from the bone in places. It looked like an elongated human, but the limbs were wrong, double-elbowed, fingers like fused bundles of wire. The skin that remained was gray and sloughing off like wet paper. It was dead. I did not study it. Curiosity is for biologists. I was a janitor of the apocalypse. I grabbed a pair of channel lock pliers and gripped the thing by a protruding ankle bone. I pulled. It was heavy, waterlogged. It slid out of the AHU with a slick, sucking sound, hitting the concrete floor with a wet flop. I dragged it to the trash incinerator chute. The crib had an old, heavy fuel oil incinerator for waste disposal, located in the basement. I opened the hatch. The draft from the chimney sucked the foul air in. I shoved the carcass in. I did not say a prayer. I threw in a handful of diesel-soaked rags. I lit a flare and tossed it down. Whoomp! I slammed the hatch and spun the locking wheel. I engaged the draft fan and the fuel pump. The incinerator roared to life. I watched the temperature gauge on the stack climb. 800 degrees Fahrenheit. 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. Ash. It would all be ash. I walked back up to the control room. I collapsed into my chair. My hands were blistered. My coveralls were soaked with sweat and condensation. I looked at the vent in the ceiling. The unistrut was still wedged there, a monument to the breach. But the crisis was not over. As the adrenaline faded, I noticed the change in the sound of the wind outside. The howl had deepened to a roar. The walls of the crib were vibrating. I looked at the barometer on the wall. It had dropped 20 millibars in 3 hours. That was a bombogenesis event. Explosive cyclogenesis. A winter hurricane. And then, the alarms started. Beep, beep, beep. I spun to the control board. A red light was flashing. High water alarm, sub-basement. The hair on my neck stood up again. The sub-basement. That was below the water line. That was where the raw water intake valves were. If the sub-basement flooded, it would short out the main breakers. The generator would die. The pumps would die. I would be in the dark, in the cold, sinking. I toggled the camera feed for the sub-basement. Black screen. The camera was gone. I grabbed the radio. Status check. I whispered to myself. I needed to go down there, all the way to the bottom, into the wet. But first, I needed to secure the perimeter I had just compromised. The hole in the AHU, the open vent. I grabbed a tube of silicone and a sheet of aluminum flashing. I patched the drill hole in the AHU. Mechanical integrity restored. Then I looked at the ceiling vent. I could not trust it. I mixed a batch of rapid set epoxy. I climbed the ladder. I slathered the edges of the grill and the drywall with the gray paste. I shoved the grill back up, forcing it into the goo, and re-wedged the unistrut. When that epoxy cured, the grill would be part of the ceiling. Nothing was getting in, and nothing was getting out. I checked the time. 1400. The storm was hitting. The waves outside were smashing against the crib with enough force to shake the coffee in my cup. And now, the water was rising inside. I grabbed my waders. The thing in the vent was a scout. The real enemy was the lake. The lake wanted its building back. I descended into the dark again, the taste of boiled copper still coating my tongue. This was the test. The systems I built were holding, but the structure itself was failing. I needed to find the leak.
And in a structure built in 1890, submerged in a frozen lake, a leak is not just a hole. It's a high-pressure injection of chaos. I reached the bottom of the spiral stairs.
The water was already shin-deep on the landing. It was freezing cold, 33 degrees. I waded in. The water swirled around my boots, black and oily. I shined my light across the surface. In the far corner, near the intake manifold, a pipe flange was spraying a fan of water against the wall. A seal failure. The vibration from the storm, or the steam hammer from my pressure washer stunt, had blown a gasket. It was a 12-inch pipe. The pressure behind it was the weight of Lake Erie. I looked at my tools. A wrench would not fix this. You can't not tighten a flange under pressure. You'll blow the bolt and kill yourself. I needed to divert the flow. I needed a clamp. I did not have a 12-inch pipe repair clamp. I looked at the pile of scrap metal in the corner. I saw a section of rubber conveyor belt and 2 heavy-duty ratchet straps. Improvise, I hissed through chattering teeth. I waded toward the jet of water. It hit me in the chest, knocking the wind out of me. The cold was instantaneous, a shock to the core. I had to wrap that flange. I had to wrestle the lake and win. This was the job. This was why I stayed. I leaned into the spray, screaming into the darkness to keep my heart beating. 1 strap, 2 straps, ratchet, click, click, click. The spray reduced to a dribble. I slumped against the wet wall, gasping. The water level was stable. I was alive. But the storm outside was just getting started. Time stopped being linear. It became cyclical, measured not in hours or minutes, but in amps, gallons, and calories. The calendar on the wall of the control room was still turned to January 2025, the month the world ended. I had not touched it. Instead, I used the logbook. I marked the passage of time with hash marks, 4 vertical, 1 diagonal. Day 284. I sat on the steel grating of the upper gantry. It was October. The air was crisp, smelling of decaying leaves blowing across the water from the mainland and the metallic tang of the lake turning over. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, devoid of contrails. I held a soldering iron in my hand. It was a butane-powered unit, since running the main generator just for small electronics was a waste of fuel I could no longer afford. I was building a charge controller. The diesel was gone. Well, not gone, but the tank level was at 8%. That was my strategic reserve, the oh shit fund for extreme cold snaps or emergency pumping. For the day-to-day, lights, the distillation rig, the radio that never spoke, I had to harvest what the lake provided. Wind. I looked up at my creation. Mounted on the railing where I had cut the ladder away was a vertical axis wind turbine, VAWT. I had built it from a split 55-gallon plastic drum, offset and mounted on a Lazy Susan bearing assembly I'd salvaged from the kitchen pantry. The central shaft was a 1-inch threaded rod, coupled to a permanent magnet DC motor scavenged from a treadmill that had been in the break room gym. Whir, thump. Whir, thump. It was not elegant. It wobbled in high gusts, but in the steady 15-knot breeze of the lake, it was pushing 24 volts at about 8 amps into the battery bank I'd dragged up from the mechanical room. I finished the solder joint on the dump load resistor. If the batteries got full, this circuit would divert the excess energy into a heating element to warm my water, preventing the turbine from overspinning and tearing itself apart. Regulation, I said to the wind. Control. My voice sounded rusty.
I had not spoken to another human being in 9 months. I found myself narrating my actions just to verify that I still existed. I packed up the tools. My hands were different now. The blisters of the first month had hardened into thick, yellow calluses. My fingernails were permanently stained black with grease and graphite. I had lost 30 pounds. My coveralls hung loose, belted tight with a length of braided rope. I checked the multimeter. 27.4 volts. The bank was floating. I walked back inside. The heavy steel door clanged shut, sealing out the wind. The interior of the crib had changed. It no longer looked like a municipal utility. It looked like the inside of a spacecraft designed by a scavenger. The control room was my bridge.
The polyethylene tent was gone, replaced by a permanent insulated hot box built from acoustic ceiling tiles and plywood I'd stripped from the office walls. It was smaller, tighter, easier to heat. I walked to the farm. The back wall of the control room, once lined with filing cabinets, was now a vertical hydroponic garden. I had used 4-inch PVC drain pipes, cut in half lengthwise to form troughs, arranged in a zigzag pattern on the wall. Water from a small reservoir was pumped to the top by a 12-volt windshield washer pump, scavenged from the maintenance cart, and trickled down through the roots of the plants before returning to the tank. Light came from 4 high-pressure sodium fixtures I had unbolted from the exterior floodlight array and rewired to run off my battery bank. They cast a harsh, orange-pink glow over the room. I checked the crop. Spinach, kale, a few straggly tomato vines that were struggling with the humidity. It was not a salad bar. It was scurvy prevention. The protein bars were long gone. The canned goods, beans, chili, soup, were down to 2 crates. I picked a single kale leaf. I scrutinized it for aphids. Clean. I ate it raw. It tasted bitter and green, like life. Nitrogen levels are low, I noted. Need to add more urine to the reservoir mix. It was gross. It was chemistry. Urea breaks down into ammonia, then nitrates. It was the closed loop. I moved to the window. The binoculars were mounted on a tripod now. I spent 2 hours every day observing the shore. It was my television. Cleveland was gone. The fires had burned themselves out months ago. Now, the city was a gray skeleton. The glass towers of downtown were jagged teeth, many windows blown out by the pressure changes of the seasons. Nature was aggressive. Even from 3 miles away, I could see the green reclaiming the gray. Vines were swallowing the highway overpasses. And the movement. In the summer, the infected, or whatever they were, had been active. I saw swarms of them moving like ants along the waterfront. They fought, they ran, they swarmed anything that made noise. But as the autumn chill set in, they had slowed down. They were ectothermic, or at least metabolically vulnerable to cold. I saw fewer of them now. They huddled in the shadows of the warehouses. I scanned the tunnel exit point at the water treatment plant. Nothing moved. I scanned the horizon of the lake. Empty. The Great Lakes shipping lanes were dead. No 1,000-foot freighters carrying taconite. No Coast Guard cutters. No pleasure boats. Just the gray waves rolling endlessly. I was the only light in the dark. I turned away from the window. The loneliness was a physical weight, heavier than the gravity of the earth. In the first month, I had cried. In the second month, I had raged, smashing a computer monitor with a wrench. Now, I just worked. The routine was the anchor. 6:11. Wake up. Check temperature. 6:15. Check battery voltage. Adjust turbine dump load. 7:11. Water maintenance. Check the still. 8:11. Fishing. 10:11. Facility inspection. 12:11. Meal. 1 fish, boiled, 1 cup vegetable matter. 13:11. Fabrication, repair projects. 18:11. Radio watch. 20:11. Reading. Technical manuals. I had memorized the Caterpillar service guide. 22:11. Sleep. If I skipped a step, the void would creep in. I picked up the bucket and the gaff hook. It was time for the harvest. I walked out to the lower gantry. The wind was biting here, spraying mist that froze on the railing. I had built a trot line system, a continuous loop of rope running through a pulley block I'd weighted and sunk to the bottom, 50 feet down. The other end ran through a snatch block on the davit arm of the crane. I clipped the drill to the winch gear. Whirr! The rope rose from the depths. Hook 1. Empty. The bait, a chunk of fish intestine, was gone. Hook 2. Seaweed. Hook 3. A walleye. Maybe 3 pounds. I unhooked the fish. It thrashed weakly, its eyes glassy. It was pale, the color washed out by the darkness of the deep water. Good boy, I whispered. I killed it quickly with a spike to the brain. No suffering. We were colleagues in survival. I reset the hook with the offal from yesterday's catch and sent the line back down. I took the fish to the utility sink. I gutted it with surgical precision. The knife was razor sharp. I sharpened it every night. I looked at the meat. It was firm, but I knew what was in it. Mercury, PCBs, microplastics, the legacy of the Rust Belt. It did not matter. The liver would process it, or it would not. Long-term cancer was a luxury problem. I was dealing with short-term caloric deficits. I cooked the fish on the hot plate, powered by the wind turbine. The smell of frying fish filled the small room, masking the smell of ozone and unwashed human. After eating, I began the daily inspection. I went down to the sub-basement. The air here was damp and cold, 39 degrees Fahrenheit constant. I shined my light on the repair I had made during the storm. The ratchet straps were still there, but I had reinforced them. I had built a concrete cairn around the pipe flange, pouring quick-set hydraulic cement into a form I'd built from plywood. It was a concrete tumor, ugly and bulbous, but it was dry. No leaks. I checked the tunnel bulkhead. The bolt I had mushroomed was rusted solid. No one had come knocking. I walked the perimeter of the foundation. The crib was essentially a hollow stone pillar. I checked for cracks. The freeze-thaw cycle of winter was the enemy now. Water gets into a hairline fracture, freezes, expands, and crack, structural failure. I found a small fissure near the north quadrant. Spiderweb cracks in the mortar. I pulled the tube of epoxy from my belt. I cleaned the crack with a wire brush. I injected the epoxy. Held, I said. I climbed back up. 240 steps. Good cardio. Evening fell. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and charcoal. I sat at the radio desk. The transceiver was a Motorola commercial base station. I had built a new antenna, a dipole cut for the 40-meter amateur band, strung between the roof and the lightning rod. I put on the headset. Static. The cosmic background radiation of the universe. I scanned the dial. 7, 100 megahertz. Static. 7, 200 megahertz. Static. 14, 300 megahertz. Wait. A rhythmic popping sound. Not voice. Not Morse code. It was a radar signature.
Or maybe an ionospheric sounder, an automated ping from some military bunker deep underground, or a weather buoy in the Atlantic that had not died yet. It was a machine talking to itself. I keyed the mic. "This is Station Crib 5, Lake Erie Sector. 1 survivor. Secure. Sustainable. Is anyone there? Over." I waited. The popping continued. Indifferent. I released the key. I was not disappointed. I had stopped expecting a rescue months ago. Rescue implies disaster. This was not a disaster anymore. This was the epoch. I turned off the radio to save power. I walked to the bookshelf. I pulled down Standard Handbook for Mechanical Engineers, 9th edition. I opened it to the section on thermodynamics of steam cycles.
I read. The words were comforting. Formulas did not change. The laws of physics were the only laws left. PV equals N or TPV equals N RTPV equals NRT was true yesterday, and it was true today, and it would be true when the sun burned out. I fell asleep in the chair, the book on my chest. I dreamed of the city, not as it was, but as it was now. I dreamed I was walking through the silent streets, fixing things, tightening loose signs, greasing hinges on swinging doors, changing light bulbs that would never turn on. I woke up with a start. The wind had died. The silence was absolute. I stood up and walked to the window. Snow was falling. Thick, heavy flakes, drifting straight down in the still air. They caught the light of my sodium grow lamps, turning into golden sparks against the black glass. The lake was freezing over. The ice sheet was forming, a gray skin creeping out from the shore. Soon, the crib would be locked in ice. The waves would stop. The fishing would get harder. I'd have to chip through the ice in the central well. But the ice also meant security. Nothing could swim to me. Nothing could boat to me. The ice was a wall. I looked at the reflection in the glass. A bearded man, gaunt, eyes sunken but hard. I looked like a monk of the new dark age. I was the keeper. I had 500 gallons of water stored. I had a hydroponic cycle establishing. I had power. I had the knowledge. I was not just surviving. I was maintaining. The world had ended, but the machine was still running. I picked up the grease gun. It was time to lubricate the wind turbine bearings. I opened the hatch and stepped out into the snow. The cold was biting, lethal, and pure. I took a deep breath. "Copy that," I said to the silence. I began to climb the tower.